Riggs, and he is the author of High Tension FDR's Battle to Power America. As I was saying before we really got started, many of us don't necessarily appreciate electricity until we don't have it. And I'm not sure that many of us have really thought about the daunting process of electrifying our community, let alone our country, and how individuals worked together early on to achieve this wonderful goal of electricity for us all. So tonight we're going to hear about that process. Many of you may know that FDR was one of the individuals involved. It is John Riggs's passion to bring together all of this information in a wonderful book. And John studied history at Swarthmore College and received his master's in public policy from Princeton. He is currently a senior fellow at the Aspen Institute, where he was at the Center of Energy Policy Making in Washington, D.C. for more than 30 years. He taught a graduate seminar in energy policy at the University of Pennsylvania, and he's moderated numerous energy forums at the Aspen Institute, as well as testified before the Congressional Energy Committees. So I want you all to join me in welcoming Jack Riggs to our wonderful virtual forum. And the very first question I have for you, Jack, is what caused you to want to write this book?
Oh, thanks, Gwen, and thank you for having me here. I was working for Congress about 30 years ago for the House Energy Committee, and I'd always loved to read history. And a wonderful book by Dan Yergin came out in about 1990 called The Prize. He actually won a Pulitzer for it. And it was a history of the world oil industry. And I was just fascinated. I love history and I worked in energy, and this was everything I wanted. And when I finished, I said, oh, I've got to read a book like that about electricity. And I went looking for it, and there wasn't one. Well, I couldn't do anything about it then. I was working full time. But I always had it in the back of my mind. The seed had been planted. And when I retired, went to part-time work, I started looking into it. I found that nobody wanted a book as comprehensive as Yergin's book on oil. There are already a lot of books about Edison, and a couple of publishers told me that the scope of a book like that was just too much for popular history. So I narrowed my focus to Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, although the backstory touches on Edison and the intervening years. But I think this was a case of what Robert Frost said he dreamed of doing, and that's to unite my avocation and my vocation. And that's how it got started.
So for those of us that haven't read the book, can you give us like the nutshell version of early developments in electricity leading up to FDR?
Yes. Obviously, there were a lot of things going on for a couple of centuries, but the electrification of America started with Thomas Edison and his first power plant in New York in 1882. And for about a decade after that, he was competing with George Westinghouse and a couple of other manufacturers. They're all trying to invent and build and compete to capture the market. In the last half of the 1880s, it was called the War of the Currents, and it became, in addition to a fight between Edison and Westinghouse, a battle between direct current, or what we know as DC, and alternating current, which is AC. And eventually, in the 1890s, AC started to win, in part due to some inventions from Nikola Tesla, an eccentric Serbian inventor, who worked briefly for Edison, couldn't persuade Edison to adopt alternating current, invented an alternating current motor, which Westinghouse bought the patent to. So Edison and Westinghouse were going at it until well into the 1890s. An early employee of Edison's, a young British immigrant who was his secretary and bookkeeper and then eventually became his financial expert, Samuel Insull, left the company when it was merged with another company to become General Electric. He went to Chicago, became president of a small utility, and over the course of about a decade, bought up or merged with every other utility in Chicago until they had a monopoly in Chicago and Cook County. And in that role, he essentially modernized, if not modernized the technology, he modernized the economics of a utility business. And eventually, almost all the other utilities followed his model. And he became the leader of the industry through the probably the first 25 years of the private industry, during the first 25 years of the 20th century. And as the industry grew, it needed a lot of capital. And a lot of financial people had learned to build what they called holding companies. It's sort of another word for trusts, which were opposed by most populists, but they were a very efficient way to raise capital. And this capital allowed them to build and start to take electricity to many homes. By the 1920s, most homes in urban America. And there was an opposition to both these structures because they couldn't be regulated. They were multi-state and all the regulation was done by states. And there were a lot of folks who thought they were charging more than they needed to. So there was an enmity between private power and those who favored public power. And in the 1920s, we think of as the Roaring '20s, they just grew like Topsy. They got bigger and bigger. Some of these holding companies were layered one on top of another. Some got as big as 10 layers. And they could siphon the dividends up those layers so a few people at the top would make most of the money from these huge empires of utilities that they controlled. And by the time of the New Deal, they were quite controversial. Some went bankrupt in the crash in 1929 and shortly thereafter. And so when Roosevelt came to power, one of his planks was to try and rein in these huge structures. He also had another major goal, and that was to bring power to rural America, which had been left out by the private utilities. They found it very expensive to run wires out to remote farms where instead of having 5 or 6 houses in a block, you might have 3 or 4 houses in a mile. And they also thought that farmers were too poor to buy much electricity, so they just ignored the rural market for the most part. And Roosevelt wanted to do something about that.
So I'm a little curious about the fact that Roosevelt, which was a man of such wealth and privilege, becomes a champion for the electrification of the United States. Clearly, in the late 1920s and 30s, when he's running for office, did he have this in his mind as a plank that he was running on, or was he developing his ideas about electrification?
Well, there's 2 questions within your question. One, how did such a patrician, wealthy person become so concerned about the downtrodden and the poor? And he had many influences. His father, who was aristocrat, both his parents were Hudson Valley aristocracy, the Dutch aristocracy, but his father taught him to be responsible for others. There was a bit of noblesse oblige there. It was not that they were equal, it was just that it was his duty to help them. He had a tutor as a boy, a French woman who was motivated by social Christianity and infused him with some of the things that motivated her. He had a prep school headmaster, the Reverend Enigat Peabody at Groton, who encouraged all of his students to go into public service. Now, Franklin Roosevelt didn't need a whole lot of push in that direction because his distant cousin, Teddy Roosevelt, was already about to be president. But then why he picked electricity as one of his issues, I think that was more a political choice. And I should say the other huge influence on his social conscience was his wife Eleanor, who was also born to wealth but became very committed to the poor. But Roosevelt saw electricity as a political issue. When he first ran for governor in New York in 1928, he used the lack of electricity in rural areas to kind of cut into the big Republican margin in upstate New York. And it really paid off. He talked about trying to bring power to them. And he also talked about trying to build state dams on the St. Lawrence and Niagara rivers to compete with the private companies. So that gave him the success he had with electricity issues in running for governor and in serving as governor made him very, very interested in the national issues when he became president.
So he becomes president, and one of the first big battles he has, I think, with Congress is over this issue of electrification, and more specifically the TVA. Could you talk a little about his relationship with Congress and or the TVA?
Yeah, first, it's good to remember that he came in with a very substantial majority in both houses of Congress. The Depression had turned the public against Hoover and the Republicans. So people wanted him to act. And one of the things that had been in the public mind during the 1920s was what to do about a federal dam that had been built on the Tennessee River in World War I to produce nitrates, which the security folks thought were possibly going to be cut off. Our main source was in Chile, and they thought during the war we might lose that, which was necessary for both fertilizer and for munitions. We built a dam at Muscle Shoals on the Tennessee River, and when the war was over, President Harding wanted to turn it over to private industry. They didn't get any really good bids, and many of the people who favored public power, in particular a senator from Nebraska named George Norris, tried very hard to have the government keep that dam and operate it as a federal dam and sell the power to other users. That was probably one of the biggest battles in the 1920s. It went on, and neither side won. So when Roosevelt came into office, one of the things he wanted to do was to take that dam at Muscle Shoals and use it as a base for a larger organization that could provide not only power for the entire Tennessee Valley, one of the poorest regions of the country, but he would also try and develop the region with irrigation and flood control and forestry and agricultural advice. And to do that, he proposed this independent organization. It was a government organization, but it didn't report to any cabinet officer. They had 3 directors, and it was quite a unique organization. And he probably got away with it because it was only one region. If he had tried to do that nationally, I suspect that would have been a bridge too far. But and it also sounded like it was going to create jobs, which was everybody's top priority in his first couple of years. So within a couple of weeks of taking office in March of 1933, he got Senator Norris to introduce this TVA bill. It passed quickly and was set up. It took a while to get running, but in retrospect, it was one of his huge successes. And one historian says it may have been the biggest battle between business and government in U.S. history. So controversial, but successful.
Some may recall the name Wendell Willkie when it comes to the Tennessee Valley Authority. Could you tell us a little about why he was so instrumental in the whole TVA argument?
Well, most of us, if we know about Wendell Willkie at all, it's from his receiving the Republican nomination for president against Roosevelt in 1940. But he made his name as a utility executive. Very fascinating guy. He was born into a Democratic family. He was a Democrat himself, had gone to Democratic conventions, voted for Roosevelt. But he became the head of one of the big holding companies. And that holding company owned the private utilities in the Tennessee Valley that were going to be severely threatened, possibly run out of business by TVA. So he became the industry's leader in the fight against TVA. And it took several years. Largely the fight was about how much territory TVA could control and what rates they would use and whether they could force some of the local utilities to buy their power instead of the private holding company's power. But he was a charismatic leader. It's kind of wonderful to see two effective politicians like Roosevelt and Wilkie, both quite popular, articulate, well-liked, except by their ideological enemies, going head-to-head on this issue. And Wilkie in particular he was a Hoosier, and he liked to portray himself as this down-home country boy. He had a lock of hair that drooped over his forehead. He'd sit in a chair and throw his leg over the arm of the chair, always casual. Time magazine at one point said that he can wear an expensive suit and make it look as though it came from Macy's bargain basement. He wanted to look like a country boy. And he was a very effective speaker, and he testified before congressional committees. It's hard for us to think about this now, but he didn't sit at a desk and testify. He would get up and walk around the room as if he was talking to a jury. And he cracked jokes to the senators or congressmen, and he was quite an effective spokesman. So, and then this led him, we'll probably come to this later, because he was such an effective leader of the fight against TVA, the industry sort of saw him as their leader in a larger sense, and he became a leader in the fight against the Roosevelt's Holding Company Act.
Okay, that all makes me wonder what Congress was like back then while they were arguing over this. Can you make some comparisons and contrasts to today and how we deal with electrical issues in Congress?
Well, there was then and still is a tension or a fight between public power and private power, and then as now Republicans tended to be more supportive of private power and Democrats tended to be more supportive of public power. But legislation then, they didn't vote in lockstep. The speaker didn't tell you how to vote if you were a member of the majority party in the House. The majority leader in the Senate didn't control things as tightly then. Individuals had a lot of influence. I mentioned Senator Norris as one. There were several others who had key roles in some of these pieces of legislation. There was also one of the dirty little secrets about Roosevelt's majority is that many of them, and particularly the committee chairmen, especially in the Senate, were Southern Democrats, many of whom were quite racist. And he had to really temper what he did on any issue having to do with race. One example, if you just think about Social Security, when it started, they excluded farm workers and domestic workers because those were largely black workers, and the Southern powers in the Senate wouldn't let it go through without that. So there were factions, as there are now. They were in session much shorter times, maybe of a 2-year term. They might have only been in session for 5 or 6 months. And they were probably more friendly than, certainly across party lines, than people in Congress are today. Probably many others, well, obviously in terms of publicity, they didn't have most of them didn't have much access to radio then. The president did, and of course no television and no internet, so it was slower.
Are there big pieces of legislation that we should know that specifically addressed the electrification of the United States?
Well, in the book I talk about 4 major initiatives. 3 of them had their own legislation. The Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, was one. The Holding Company Act to break up or better regulate the huge holding company empires. The Rural Electrification Administration, which we haven't talked about, but that was another of his huge successes. And then the 4th one was building a couple of really big dams on the Columbia River, Bonneville and Grand Coulee, which helped provide power and helped settle the rural areas of the Northwest. And it's worth noting that both those dams on the Columbia River and the dams that were built by TVA in the Tennessee Valley were extremely important in getting the U.S. ready for World War II. The private industry usually will not build a plant until the demand is already there and they're sure they're going to be able to get their money back. The government could plan and design dams and have them ready to go, maybe even start building in anticipation of that demand. And with the war clouds on the horizon in the late 1930s, Roosevelt put together a group of government officials to try and anticipate what we would need in the way of electricity. And they all said, we're going to need more than the private industry is going to give us. So they built more dams for TVA. They added turbines and generators on the big dams on the Columbia River. And by the end of World War II, most of the most of the new generating capacity that we built, which helped to arm the country to build airplanes, aluminum, things like that, most of that new power came from TVA and the Columbia River dams. And the rural electrification program, which I just touched on lightly, probably the most, it tugs at your heart. When you read about what it was like on farms for most farmers in the 1920s, we think about the 20s as the roaring 20s and the economy was booming. Not on the farms, it wasn't. Farm prices were dropping throughout the 20s. Most farmers were still living the way their grandparents had, no electricity, no running water. A few owned their land and there was a struggle to pay the mortgage. If they were renting, it was a struggle to pay the rent. And yet they saw the Sears Roebuck catalog every year and they saw all these appliances for sale. And most of them went into town now and then and they probably saw some of these houses that were electrified and they knew what they were missing. So very early on, at the instigation of somebody who had worked with him briefly when he was governor of New York, another fascinating character named Morris Llewellyn Cook, a Republican, but quite committed to public power and rural electrification. He designed a program, took it into the Secretary of Interior, another progressive Republican working for Roosevelt, Harold Ickes, and proposed a plan to work with private industry to try and electrify the countryside. And when he said private industry, Ickes said, I don't want to have anything to do with those sons of bitches. And so Cook said, well, if I could design something that would be strictly government owned, would you support that? He said, yeah, try it, draft something, let's see it. So he came up with a plan that was basically, it was government structured, but the idea would be to make loans to farmer-owned cooperatives to wire their neighborhoods and to buy appliances. And then as they paid back the loans, the loans could be loaned out again to other borrowers. And it was a huge success, very popular. Even the industry and the Republican Congress didn't like to propose it because it was so popular in many of their districts. And there were about 10% of farms electrified when Roosevelt took office, mostly in New England and some in the far west where they had a lot of running water, hydropower. And by 1949, I think we were at something like 79% electrification, and by the mid-50s it was virtually universal. Hugely successful. I would say, along with Social Security, the rural electrification program was probably the most valuable government program for individuals, for families.
So that sort of talks about the New Deal in electrification. What legacy do you think that the New Deal power politics had?
Well, Roosevelt was not a revolutionary. We ended up with a hybrid system. He built some of those big federal dams and broke down the holding companies to increase competition. He said he wanted the public power on the Columbia River and in the Tennessee Valley. Originally, he wanted to do one on the Colorado and one on the St. Lawrence. He saw them as a yardstick against which you could measure the prices of private utilities to see if they were overcharging. Now, Wendell Willkie said that yardstick is rubber to the very last inch because it's not a precisely fair comparison. The federal dams were built for three purposes: electricity, flood control, and navigation. And so they could charge say 2/3 of the capital cost to the flood control and irrigation, which made it much easier to, you had to charge the electricity customers less. So it was an unfair comparison. And yet, after the fact, we can look back, and during the 1920s, when the holding companies were electrifying most of urban America and bragging about their technological advances, prices stayed flat. And during the New Deal and a couple years after that, with these federal dams in there, with breaking up the holding companies, with the yardstick, however effective it was, prices dropped fairly dramatically. So there is a real comparison, and I think the public power folks have a good argument that they helped bring prices down. But they didn't become the major force in our electricity system. From the end of, I'd say from about 1950, for 25 years, when the US was growing like crazy, the percentage of electricity generated by private power stayed at about 73 or 4%. And the electricity generated by public power, and that's both the big federal dams and some smaller municipal utilities in places like Los Angeles and Seattle, that was about 26 or so percent. And that ratio stayed pretty constant. So we had a system that survives to this day with some public and some private, and nobody would have designed it this way, but it's working. And both sides wish they could take over the other, but it's probably not going to happen.
Is that combination of public and private unusual throughout the world?
It is. It is. I'm not familiar with all of the other systems, but there are many countries that have state-owned utilities, maybe most, I'm not sure, and some that have private. I think the United Kingdom has a bit of a blend, a hybrid, but most are probably one or the other.
So take me then through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Bring us up to date with our electrification systems. Do we still have vulnerabilities based upon the way we were founded?
Well, I would say the one big mistake that the founders of the industry made was they paid no attention to conservation. It was always better to build bigger and sell more and use more electricity. Now, particularly because of climate change and partly because of costs, we realize that that's a mistake and we've got to get people out of that mindset. But that's a question that's worthy of another book or many, but a few of the big things that happened, nuclear power came in the 1950s, and then in the 60s and early 70s, people thought it was going to be too cheap to meter. And so we started building a lot of nuclear power plants. And then after the 3 Mile Island accident and the high costs of building those plants, nuclear kind of lost favor. More slowly, wind and solar came in. They're still, far behind the others in terms of their actual production right now, although their potential is huge. In the late 80s and early 90s, there was a move, it was called a move to deregulate the industry, but it was really just a way to regulate it differently. And legislation that was passed in Congress in the 80s created what are called independent power producers. It could be an independent company could build a plant, produce the power, and sell it to the private utilities, so the private utilities didn't have to generate that themselves. It brought more competition into the industry, and over time, it tended to break up the utilities, which originally produced the power, sold it at retail, and transmitted it across the country or to neighboring utilities. Now they've sort of broken up those three functions, distribution, transmission, and sale. So the industry looks a little bit different at the utility level. And one thing that's interesting to note, the Holding Company Act, which was one of Roosevelt's big victories, he didn't get everything he wanted, but he largely won. The industry always wanted to get rid of that. And when I was working in Congress in the 1980s, I first started hearing about this effort to repeal it. In Washington, everybody has to have an acronym for everything. So the Public Utilities Holding Company Act was always called PUCA. But then the opponents who wanted to get rid of it started calling it PUCA. and it was kind of it never came to a vote, but it was always an argument in the background. And finally, in 2005, they succeeded in repealing it. There's a better ability to regulate interstate sales now than there was back in the 30s. So it's not as if we've gone back to where it was, but the utilities wanted to be able to merge and build bigger companies and have companies that crossed different time zones, different geographical regions, different industries, so they'd have a more balanced load. And they eventually won when they had a Republican Congress and president.
So I assume that if FDR, Wendell Willkie, and Thomas Edison were all standing outside of Las Vegas in a night and saw the strip all lit up, you think they'd be in awe?
Oh, I'm sure they would be. I think they would understand how we got there, but they would be in awe.
So we do have a question. Someone has made the comparison that there seems to be a parallel between the power needs of rural America in the past and the needs for internet connectivity in rural America today. How do you see the latter problem being addressed going forward? And do you see other similarities?
Well, that's the main one, and I'm not at all an expert on communications and broadband, but I think the concept of using the federal government to step in and do what doesn't look commercially attractive to the private companies, whether it's through loans, whether it's through setting up a competing organization. I just don't know enough about the industry to know, but several people have asked that question, and I think people are looking at rural electrification as a model, even if it's not a precise model.
Thank you. Do you see other comparisons with other, I don't want to say utilities, but utilities?
Well, in a broader sense, I think this hybrid solution where you have some private and some public might be helpful with lots of kinds of infrastructure, whether it's water, whether it's transportation, bridges, electrification of railways. There are a whole lot of ways where I think the profit motive and the drive of private industry and the borrowing capacity and the broader goals, the national focus rather than the profit motive of government would make the hybrid model useful in a lot of areas. And again, I'm not an expert in those areas, so this is just a generality, but I think it's promising.
What do you think about the contemporary blackouts? And do you think there's been enough done to sort of address the failures of the grid?
The ones that caused the blackouts that we remember, New York and the Northeast, and there was one in the West, each time one of those happens, they learn from it and they do better. I think the risk now could be from a cybersecurity threat, somebody hacking into the systems, and we are interdependent. There is always a potential for another big blackout, and you hope it can be contained, and they have systems where they're trying to, but we could have a much more efficient grid, much more efficient transmission technology, and a grid that is perhaps better managed. It's broken down into several regional transmission organizations now. I believe they're well run. I haven't been in touch with them for a long time. But there is a threat there. Even sunspots, people say, could take out a large part of the power grid.
Do you think that there was more that Truman could have done after the war, or could we have gone further than we did, further than FDR envisioned?
Well, we did continue building dams. A lot of dams that were planned on the Columbia River and in the Tennessee Valley continued to be built into Truman's term and even into the 50s. Now, Eisenhower supposedly said to his cabinet that he said he'd like to get rid of TVA, but he didn't suppose they could do that. I'm not sure what Truman could have done in the short time he had, and he was quite unpopular at first. I think Roosevelt's victories lasted, and I'm not sure how. And the implementation of the Holding Company Act, the act wasn't finally declared constitutional until I think 1948 or 9, and anyway, right after the war, and it took the Securities and Exchange Commission several years to break up these companies. So it wasn't until 1955 that actually had been carried to its conclusion. There were still about, I want to say, 15 holding companies left, and according to the law, they couldn't be those 10-layer things. You could only have 2 layers above the utilities, and they had to be contiguous. They couldn't be spread all over the country. And as one economic historian said, no holding company died that had any reason for living. But several did survive. They were the big ones. You probably know about some of them. And then now more and more mergers are taking place.
You know, you're talking to Northeast Ohio, and we kind of have had a huge battle, I think, in the 70s when a former mayor, Kucinich, tried to switch over many decades of private industry and put the Cleveland Public Power out of business. Do you have any comments about that?
Well, it's a throwback. I recall that, I'm not sure how aware I was at the time, but Cleveland did have a private and a public utility, which a couple of cities did. Most of them went one way or the other, but back in the early days of electricity, they went to war. They'd be cutting down each other's poles and things like that. But I know that Kucinich did try to force the private utility out and make it a public utility, and I don't even know the outcome of it. And in your region, of course, Wendell Willkie got his start in utilities in Akron. He was from Indiana, but after he came back from World War I, they wanted him to run for Congress as a Democrat, and he looked at the district and said, "I might win it once, I could never win it a second time." So he went to look for another career. Somebody referred him to Firestone Tire and Rubber. He went there to work as a lawyer for them, and then went into a private firm that happened to represent a predecessor of Ohio Edison, and then that got picked up in this huge holding company that he eventually became the president of. So there's an Ohio base here.
Similar to your book, do you think that there are other books that have been written about the history of the telegraph/telephone? Are you interested in those other kinds of sort of utility histories?
I'm interested, but I had spent 30 years working on energy, so I had a bit of a head start. I'm not sure I could do the same with telegraph and so on.
Well, you mentioned Jurgen's book about oil and how pivotal that was. Do you think there are other books that examine other industries?
Well, I've looked for some because I wanted to read one about railroads, and the one I happened to buy was way too academic and detailed for the kind of overview I was looking for. And I should say also that my book is a very narrow slice of the whole electricity picture. One book I would recommend to people who are interested in the bigger picture: for the first 15 years, when Edison and Westinghouse were competing and things were just getting started and they built Niagara Falls Dam and things like that, there's a wonderful book, I think it's about 8 or 10 years old, called Empires of Light by Jill Jones, Jones spelled with 2 N's. And I think she may have been a magazine writer first. It's very, very readable, and that's a good story. And there's not as much on the period between the Edison years and the New Deal. There are lots of books, but none that I can say this will cover it all for you. And other industries, I've been too narrowly focused for the last several years, so I can't tell you.
Talk to me about LBJ. He's often credited with bringing the promise of electricity to the rural South. Are you sort of saying to me that he doesn't necessarily get that accolade?
Well, actually, he shows up in my book briefly. He was a first term, maybe he's in his first full term as congressman. He came in a special election, and Roosevelt really liked him. And he had sort of made his name by trying to getting federal money to try and complete a dam and sell cheap power to some co-ops in his district. So he was very much committed to rural electrification. And when an administrator of the REA resigned, Roosevelt offered LBJ the job. But he was near the end of his second term. Nobody was confident that he would get a third term, and Johnson figured he had a better future in Congress than working for somebody else in what may be the last years of an administration. So he didn't take the job. But then later on, he clearly pushed for electrification in Texas. And in terms of the international approach, there's another character in this book named David Lillianthal. He was one of the directors of the TVA, the one in charge of their electricity policy, and he was the one that on a day-to-day level was going head-to-head with Wendell Willkie. And after World War II, many countries looked at TVA as a model, and they wanted to see if they could build something like that in their countries. And he did a lot of consulting, and others did too, who knew TVA. So I don't know how much of it was Johnson's responsibility. He was a strong supporter. When I think of his administration, that's not what comes to mind.
Some would say, and perhaps they're socialists, they would argue that private utility companies make their profit their priority, and this can lead to disenfranchising many of the poor economically disadvantaged. On the other hand, public utilities make it a priority to offer their service that would be economically affordable to all. How do you sort of respond to all of this?
Well, there's some truth in both of those. I mean, private utilities are private corporations, and they do have a responsibility to their shareholders. And in the 1920s in particular, they had a huge public relations effort going, talking about how they were public servants. If you look at how many utilities, fewer today, but back then many of them had public service in their name. And they considered themselves altruistic. Now, they were making profits, but they ran advertising campaigns, planted newspaper columns, prepared lessons for school kids that talked about how utilities were serving the public and doing good for the nation. And many people bought it because they were getting this wonderful new service called electricity. And they didn't know if they were paying too much or too little, so they loved it. Today, I think the government can more easily subsidize public power, even if it's a public municipal utility. The crossover between the city budget and the utility budget is pretty hard for people to understand. So there may be some subsidies there, or maybe the utility is charging ratepayers and letting the city government do things that they couldn't raise taxes for. There are lots of things you could say pro and con for both models. And I don't want to make a final judgment. I don't want to say one is greedy and the other is altruistic, but public power has some advantages.
Let's talk a little bit about infrastructure and replacement. Certainly a lot of this that was done under the guise of FDR and the New Deal. Do we need to be looking at the replacement of a dam? What's the cost of a dam? For heaven's sakes, this has got to be extravagantly costly now. And do we need to go through the whole process of restoring dams, or is there a different technology perhaps that can achieve the same thing?
I think we have probably used the best hydropower sites in the country, and dams aren't seen today as the unalloyed good that they were in the 1930s. Another thing, if you could go back and change something that was done back in those days, the lack of concern about what we did to fish in the Columbia River and its tributaries was just dreadful. And there were people trying, and a few people knew what was going to happen, but they were overwhelmed by the people who just wanted to bring cheap electricity and build up the region. But most of those dams have a long life ahead of them, the big ones. and I don't think they'll be replaced. They can be repaired and kept running for a long time. It's unlikely that we'll build any big ones, any big new ones. There is a movement in the country to try and remove a lot of the smaller dams that, some of them going back a couple hundred years, ownership unclear, maybe they're not operating anymore, maybe they were really just servicing one little mill or water wheel, but they've also damaged rivers and fish, and there's a pretty strong movement to try and remove some of those.
I should have told you that I'm the archivist in this community, and Hudson had public power very early. In the early 1890s, we had a multimillionaire that paid for our public power and paid to have our telephone wires put underground. Our phones were underground in 1901, 1902. We had free public power. Is this a common thing that occurred at the beginning of the 20th century, or was Hudson kind of unusual?
I'm not aware of anything like that. Clearly, many of the first local utilities were built as private utilities if there was one or more local businessmen who was willing to put up a lot of the capital. The towns that wanted electricity and didn't have that kind of financial base frequently were the ones that built municipal utilities. Now, I hadn't heard about where some rich guy funded a municipal utility.
He did.
Nice place to grow up, I guess.
Well, to this day, Hudson is a wonderful community in that you don't see utility lines. They're just non-existent in our community because they were put underground so early and maintained the whole time. Unfortunately, our multimillionaire rather got upset with the community, and our free public power ended a while ago. Someone else wants
better conservationists when that happened.
Someone else wants to know about battery technology and its relationship to electrical infrastructure. What comments would you like to make there?
Well, improved battery technology is huge because that's what's going to allow solar and wind to grow. It's the cliche to say that you can't use wind power when the wind's not blowing, and you can't use solar power when the sun's not shining. Well, you can if you've got storage. And an array of batteries can do it, but bigger, more efficient batteries can also allow us to electrify our automotive fleet. And that's going to be a huge victory in the fight against climate change. It's expensive, and we don't have quite the batteries we need yet, but that technology is moving fast. As is wind power. The price of wind is coming down dramatically, and when we go to more offshore wind farms, that's going to be another big growth. I don't think anybody's going to build a new coal plant anymore.
Sort of that brings up the whole discussion of these wind farms. We're very close. Obviously, Lake Erie is where I fish a great deal, and there are several proposals to make wind farms out in the middle of Lake Erie to generate electricity. What do you think of harnessing wind power for the sake of electricity?
I think it's a good thing to do. It's easier in the oceans where you can go further offshore and you don't have the so-called visual pollution. You obviously have to pay attention to the people who live locally. Are you destroying a fishing industry by doing it? Are you jeopardizing some sea route? There's some places the Navy doesn't want us to build them. I don't know the geography of Lake Erie well enough to know where you could or couldn't put them, but there are pretty good regulatory structures in place to make sure that those arguments will be hashed out.
So in your vision of the next 150 years, do you see electricity still being involved in our society? Do you still see us generating it in the same way?
Well, I have to say I've not thought about what it would look like in 150 years. I'm pretty sure we won't be generating it in the same way. I don't know how. There may be something that replaces electricity. I don't know what it would be. People talked about fusion energy, and then even cold fusion. So there are a lot of dreamers out there, but Edison was a dreamer. So I think there will be big changes, and I can't tell you what they'll be.
Well, I hope they come from an Ohioan. Mr. Riggs, it's been a delight to talk to you this evening. Do you have further questions or comments that you want to share with us?
Um, no, I don't think so. I'd be happy to have questions from any of your audience if you have them. I have to say that although I'm not from Ohio, I have a lot of connections there. My favorite cousin grew up in North Canton and went to Mount Union in Kent State. And my mother and my brother went to Oberlin, and I drove back and forth on the turnpike for many, many years to college and grad school. So,
Well,
and
we might want to remind you that our Cleveland Browns just made it into the football playoffs.
I heard, and you will probably be shocked to know that the Washington football team also did with a losing record.
Wow, I did not know that. Thank you so much for your time with us this evening and for talking to us about electricity. Oh, Laura has one more comment. She wants to know, do you think that the electrification of the United States was FDR's greatest achievement, or do you think that there were other more significant achievements?
Well, I think the two most significant ones were uh, reducing the huge rate of unemployment when we came in, and a couple of these electrical programs were a big part of that. And then holding the country together and winning the war, and these electrical programs were part of that. But I wouldn't say that any of them, or even the combination of all of them, was more important than getting us out of the Depression and winning the war.
Well, thank you. Hopefully, we won't need a war to advance our electrification into the next millennium. We truly appreciate you taking the time to answer our questions. I want to remind everybody else, don't forget to purchase a copy of his book, High Tension, which is available at the Learned Owl, or obviously check it out at the library. And I look forward to your next book. I think it would be very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And thank you all for joining us this evening. We wish you all a wonderful January evening in the year 2021. Thank you.